three institutions organizing this side event. The University of Venice, my own university, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and the Union for the Mediterranean. These are the three institutions who partnered on the organization of this session, simply because the focus of their own activities is really climate change in the Mediterranean region and in African regions. And the goal of the session is not only to talk about financing, investments, and entrepreneurship development in this region, but also to understand how these mechanisms to implement emission reduction or adaptation to climate change can support economic development. I would like to keep the introduction very short and give the floor to the speakers. We are live streaming the session, so there will be also an audience from the outside, and questions will come also from the outside. So I'll give the floor to Gramenos Mastroianni, who is the co-chair and co-organizer with me of this session, of this side event, and leads the Union for the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Carraro, who is way more experienced than me, will do the real moderation of this panel. Up to me, just a few words about this title. Climate mitigation. In principle, it's evidence. We need to achieve it. Adaptation. Again, in principle, it's evidence. So why science? Technology, okay, it's one of the ways to achieve concrete results by making our activities more efficient, but why science? Do we need science more than already we have to prove evidence? Actually, I would like to propose a reasoning that starts from human nature. And I would like to start quoting what happened with palm oil. At a certain point, a very reduced group of people who, for unknown reason, incorporate in their decisions the common good, which is statistically proven to be a group ranging between 0.8 and 1% of the world population, decided to react to the fact that palm oil was causing palm oil production, not palm oil itself, so on such a scale, was causing damages on the plan of what we consider common goods. Damage to the forest, damage to the indigenous people, damage to fauna, especially the famous orangutan. And they organized a strong reaction on the plan of the common good. There is among this reaction a famous video produced by Greenpeace that we believe is the source of inspiration of the film Avatar. It's a video in which you see an orangutan defending his home tree against a caterpillar. You cannot but be moved by watching that video, but then commotion lasts a few seconds and nothing changes. Something changed when the message shifted target. When it switched from it harms our future, it harms the forest, it harms the indigenous people, it harms the orangutan, to a full me, it harms you, because the message was imprecise. Palm oil is not harmful. Processed palm oil is, but then also extra virgin olive oil processed that way becomes harmful. But this is another story. So it needed to target the individual to start changing conditions. So what do we need from science? And I take it from the point of view of someone who is constantly in the middle of the so-called science policy interface. Of course, the evidence is known by our policymakers. Of course, it is known by our companies. But then it needs to become more compelling. It needs to become an evidence that is deployed into making us understand that it concerns us all. It's not this problem of the future of mankind, which belongs to us, but actually belongs to nobody because it belongs to everybody. So while we tackle the problem of having a really science meaning objective, inspired climate policy in the Mediterranean, which is at very high risk. In Africa, our brothers closely connected to our swords and to our futures. I believe that science has to play not only an informative role, but at this point, and this is my personal invitation, I think we need to ask the science to be the actors of the marketing of our future in the way they speak, in the way they motivate policy and economy, making it personal. If we don't do that, we can have tons of good data, tons of inspiring theories, but human nature is what it is, and things will go too slowly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gramenos, and thank you for these interesting suggestions and ideas. But I think that the discussion, if you want to participate in discussion later, will further develop some of the contents of the ideas that you have proposed just now. Let's move to the first speaker. The first speaker is Barbara Buchner, who is the director of CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, and is probably well known all over the world for her work on climate finance. And climate finance is the first cornerstone of the process of the building that we would like to outline in this side event. And it's a cornerstone because if we want to implement actions to reduce emissions or to adapt to climate change, we need financial resources, and these financial resources are missing. Still, there is a huge gap from what we need and what is currently available, even though in the last years, financing for climate change has been increasing quite remarkably. So let's give the floor to Barbara. She will tell us more about the state of climate finance today, and the prospects and the evolution, the future evolution of climate finance, with a focus on African countries and developing countries in particular, because the problem is there, it's not in developed ones. Barbara.
Great. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and particular pleasure to be here close to you, Carlo.
Thank you.
Because, like we said, we have to make this personal. We have to keep you also interested in what we do. This is for me very personal because Carlo was my PhD supervisor and my first real boss, so I would not be where I am today without all that I learned from you. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm now running an organization which is global, Climate Policy Initiative. Those of you who are not familiar with it, we are an analytical and advisory organization. We work mostly with governments and support governments and financial institutions on thinking about how you can drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we have a very deep expertise in policy and finance, because for us this is really where you can make a difference and where you can accelerate and trigger more investments into climate and more generally sustainable development. So what I'm going to present you today is one of the flagship projects that we have. It's gone away. Okay, I'm going to restart that. Well, it is basically what we are most known for. One of the first reports that we got most known for might be broadcasted or not. If not, I'm going to...
It's not there. Yeah. Okay, there it is.
Here we go. Okay, fantastic. So one of the things that we at CPI are most known for is really providing granular data on how much money is flowing into climate activities, through what type of actors, through what type of instruments, and where it does end up. And we do that because we do want to help decision makers to really kind of make informed decisions, and our work is being used both by the negotiators here at this COP and previous COPs, but also by the IPCC, and also has been endorsed by the G20 and the G7. So it's really something, I think the right information can give you the background on how to improve the current overarching landscape of climate finance. So just very briefly, let me see whether this works now. Yes. So this CPI global climate finance landscape, it is the most comprehensive overview of climate finance flows. So what we do is we bring together different types of data sources and we really focus it on the global climate finance. So it's both public and private. It's not to be confused with the 100 billion. We really want to understand where we stand today compared to the global climate temperature goals that we are having. Let me go directly to some of the key findings, and I think that you're going to hear some good news, but you're also going to hear some bad news. I think the good news is that for the first time we have hit the trillion milestone in terms of global public and private climate finance. So our latest data, which is based on all available data sources in 2021 and 2022, show that we have reached almost 1.3 trillion US dollars in global climate finance. And this is basically an amount that has doubled since 4 years ago. So this is very good news. I do want to stress that this news is not only actual increases in investments, but still it's mostly increases in investments. We have around 440 billion US dollars in new mitigation investments, particularly in the transport sector and in renewable energy. In addition to that, the remainder of the increase that we have is due to better data sources. And I do want to also stress that this is good news too, because we do need to have better data. We still have very scattered data that therefore does not allow us to come up with the right information. However, I already said, okay, very good news, we're going in the right direction, but this graph here basically shows you where we are in terms of climate finance on the left-hand side, the green bar, and then our estimates based on various scenarios from organizations like the International Energy Agency, the Global Commission on Adaptation, on what are the estimates in different sectors in terms of the needs for climate investments if we want to stick to the 1.5 degrees temperature pathway. So you can see here that we need at least 5 times as much investments than we see today, and that is just the minimum bar, but the average figure that we have is that by 2030 we need about 9 trillion US dollars if we really want to keep our transition towards a sustainable future and in a way also like avoid the worst implications from climate change. The money is there. I think I want to make this point as well. There is liquidity in the market, and I want to put this 1.3 trillion a little bit in context. This 1.3 trillion is 1% of global GDP. It's 1% of global GDP. We spend about twice of that on military at the moment. We have still every year 1 trillion of direct subsidies for fossil fuels and 4 to 5 trillion of indirect fossil fuel subsidies. So it's not only about increasing the quantity of climate finance, it's also about shifting the existing resources away from harmful activities towards climate-friendly and sustainable activities. And so again, the money is there. It's not something we cannot do. I think the other point I also want to make is that it does make economic sense to do that, because we know that in the longer term, the implications of climate impacts are going to have very high social economic losses. So this graph here just shows you basically that if you were to meet the climate finance needs by 2050, you would actually have very high avoided losses in terms of social and economic implications. So if you, in other words, continue to stick to the business as usual, you would have very high losses, which you can see here on the very right-hand side. This is, I know it's late in the day, but I never can resist to show this one. My communications team now tells me I have to call it the Sankey diagram, but this one was born in Venice, so it's still my spaghetti graph, as I call it. It basically shows you from a snapshot of where we stand today in terms of global climate finance. You can see from the left-hand side basically all the sources, public and private, and intermediaries that are behind climate investments. You then go along the life cycle of climate finance flows through the types of instruments that are being used to where the investments actually end up, both in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation, and in terms of activities that have both benefits for adaptation and for mitigation. And finally, what are the sectors that it ends up? Let's go a little bit more into the details here. I think very important who is behind these climate investments, who is behind the 1.3 trillion US dollars. We can see that we have actually the public sector at the moment that is slightly ahead of the private sector in terms of investing in climate activities. It's about 51% comes from the public sector. Within the public sector, very important actor group are development finance institutions. We've seen that trend over the last years, and they continue to increase their investment, particularly national development finance institutions, national development banks. Development finance institutions are around 30% of the overarching climate finance that we can see. So they have an extremely important role, and I think it's something we could also go into in the discussion on how does that link to some of the discussions and reform agendas that are on the table around MDB reforms and international financial architecture. Same time, on the private side, you can see that we have commercial financial institutions followed by corporations, but also by households that have been really leading the way in terms of their investments. Very briefly, mitigation finance continues to attract most of the investments. We have 91% of global climate finance goes towards mitigation, and much of that is actually coming from the private sector. So private sector, you can see here in orange, is actually the one who is focusing really on mitigation. I think this is good news. It shows that the market has been maturing. It shows that there are technologies that have really kind of come down in terms of cost, and that it is competitive for the private sector to go into that. Much less so, as you can see here, in terms of adaptation or activities that have adaptation and mitigation, because obviously this is still kind of a more difficult field and much more related to a public good in general. While we have seen, again, a record high in terms of mitigation finance, it's a 1.2 trillion out of the 1.3 is going towards mitigation. We still see that there's huge gaps if we want to keep on going towards filling the overarching investment gap. And I think this is, you can see here in this slide, in green, the very small bars are actually the current financial flows. In yellow are the needs, and on the secondary axis you see the potential of different sectors. And so you can see here that in absolute terms it is the transport and renewable energy sectors that require most investments, but I think what is worrisome for us is that sectors such as agriculture, forestry and land use and industries are actually the ones that require in relative terms most investment, so you need to scale most, and that's particularly worrisome because agriculture, forestry and land use sectors is the one that has the most mitigation potential. So there's already existing technologies that really could get us very quickly towards kind of filling the gap. In terms of adaptation finance, you can see again we have managed to see a record high in our latest figure. It is positive that we can see adaptation finance growing in absolute terms. It's a little over 60 billion. But at the same time, it has actually decreased in terms of the overall share of global climate finance. So I think this is something which, again, is very worrisome. It's only 5% of current overarching financial flows go towards adaptation and resilience activities, at least based on the data that we do have at the moment. Again, just comparing what we have today in terms of actual transaction to the needs that we see in the market, indicate that we need at least 3.5 times as much of investments if we can want to meet our common climate goals. So there is a huge kind of call for action, particularly in the context of developing countries. Carla, you mentioned very briefly the geographic focus, which I think is extremely important as well, because again, 1.3 trillion sound fantastic, but if you look where it ends up, it is mostly in East Asia and Pacific, followed by Western Europe and US and Canada. And these three regions together attract almost 85% of all climate finance flows. We have this year for the first time also looked at other aggregation categories of countries like least developed countries and emerging markets and developing countries, and we can see that least developed countries attract only about 2% of overarching flows, while they are the most vulnerable ones. And also looking at emerging markets and developing countries, they're around kind of 16%. So very, very low compared to the needs there, and very low compared particularly to some of the vulnerabilities that these countries have. Going a little bit to the positive side now, again, we do want to understand where we stand in terms of climate finance, but we also want to not only say, okay, we need to do more, we want to come up with concrete solutions. So what we have done at CPI over the last 10 years actually is work with other institutions across the public and private sector to incubate new financial structures that really can address some of the gaps that I've shown. And the one example I wanted to show here is this Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance that we manage, and which brings together, again, like representatives from insurance companies, from institutional investors, from development finance institutions, from national development banks, etc., to really identify the most promising solutions that entrepreneurs have that can address the barriers in the market, and therefore really come up with ways of closing some of the gaps that I've shown. Just in a nutshell, the impacts that we have had up to now, again, we launched this lab in 2014. We have since then managed to develop almost 70 specific financial structures and blended finance instruments that have together kind of gone on to mobilize more than $3.5 billion. We're actually going to have an announcement later this week because we've managed to cross a new threshold with capital mobilized through our lab solutions. And I think very importantly that out of this current $3.5 billion that we've managed to help mobilize, almost 1.5 billion come really from the private sector. So I think it is important to think about how can we use public finance more effectively to unlock private capital, because we do know that public capital will continue to remain scarce, so we really need to come up with more innovative solutions that can attract private financial institutions also into emerging economies and into developing countries. The one case study I wanted to call out here, and where we hopefully will hear more from another speaker on this panel, is the Catalyst Climate Resilience Fund, which is a leading impact fund and accelerator that really helps support tech companies and startups in Africa that are really thinking about how can you come up with successful business models for a resilient, climate resilient future in Africa. So the Catalyst Fund, again, was one of our last cohort of lab instruments. I do want to stress here, it's not that easy to get into these cohorts. There's huge competition by now because we do provide quite a bit of technical support and then matchmaking with investors. But I think these types of case studies just show you that there is a lot of innovative thinking out there, and there is a need to help build the capacity that really then can help scale investments that ultimately can help fill the investment gap that I've highlighted. And again, I won't go into more detail here, but I think it's a very promising and successful idea that is already kind of going on to mobilize specific funding on the ground. Just a call for action in case there is anyone here in the room or who is like online, who is interested or has some ideas that could mobilize capital, particularly private capital, into some of the climate relevant sectors in emerging economies. We currently are calling for new ideas, so we have an open call for ideas for our next cohort of the lab cycle. We will have for the first time 10 ideas that we will develop across mitigation and adaptation with a specific focus on Africa, on Latin America, but also like in Southeast Asia. So if there's ideas out there, please apply. We have our website is up to date with the details that you have, and hopefully in this way we can help build the next generation of entrepreneurs and build the capacity that is needed to really kind of implement projects on the ground. My last slide before I hand back to you, Carlo, is I think we have the work that we've done has kind of led to 4 areas where we feel that there is a really need for more action. The first one is around transforming the financial system, and that is both on the public and on the private side. On the public side, Again, there is a need, and there has been a lot of work particularly over the last 12 months, to thinking about how can we reform an international financial architecture, how can we really come up with a systemic shift in the financial system. There, I think, particularly public development banks or multilateral development banks have a skill set that can unlock more capital. We need to use their capital more effectively. We need to use more concessional finance to really address some of the risks and build enabling environments that then allow the private sector to come in at scale. But also the private financial institutions need to step up more. We have seen lots of commitments to net zero pathways, which is obviously very welcome, but we still need to see that translate into actual shifts in their capital towards more climate-friendly activities and away from harmful activities. Second area is around bridging climate and development. I think we have been acting a lot in silos over the last decades, and it really is time to think about how can we harness the synergies between development and climate. There's lots of co-benefits on nature, on health, on different types of both mitigation, but also like addressing the physical risks of climate impact. So there's a really need to think bigger and see how can we bring these two agendas together and this way have a higher impact. And I think the second point just under this second bucket is also the data shows that unfortunately, well, it's actually normal, but data shows that our economies are still very much built on fossil fuels. So we need to think about pathways away from like phasing out fossil fuel consumption production, but as doing that, as it's so embedded in the economic system, we need to think about how we can really address all the impacts on all stakeholders from local to national, including communities and workers. We need to come up with alternative scenarios that can really allow us to shift the system. Third point, I actually did not say that when I was talking about the geographic split of climate finance. Mobilizing domestic capital is key. More than 80% of current climate finance, global climate finance, is raised and distributed in the same country. And that shows the importance of enabling environments, of policy, of regulation, and of the domestic capital market and domestic financial institutions. They really understand the market. They are the ones who can address issues. They're the ones who can build the capacity. So thinking more about how can we mobilize domestic capital is key. Then the final point before I close, and that is a point very close to my heart because again, this was the first flagship report that we started at CPI, and we still have more than 10 years ago, so we have more than a decade of experience in this area. But we still have huge data gaps in understanding climate investments, in understanding climate finance, particularly on the domestic level and on the private financial data beyond renewable energy and transport. So we really need to close the data gaps and improve the data information. There needs to be mandatory disclosures that allow us to really kind of act on actual investments and trends in portfolios. And you also need to think about how can we standardize and simplify the many taxonomies and the many methodologies that are out there, which sometimes I call it the wild west of standards. So we need to make it simpler also for institutions to actually report to that. And with that, I think, again, I'm going to head back to you, Carlo, and again, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Barbara, and congratulations for the excellent work CPI is doing, not just in providing information, data on climate finance, and you're right, information which is used by all international organizations and even private institutions, and even give a look to the recent report published by Nick Stern on climate finance. I mean, the source of data is coming from CPI. But you do something more. You work also on supporting entrepreneurship development and startups by funding these ideas, by supporting these ideas Barbara was talking about. And I also like your last comment on data, the importance on data, because it's exactly the connection with next speaker and next contribution, next presentation by Carlo Bontempo, who is the director of the Copernicus Climate Service at ECMWF. And he's the one providing data, and the basic data that all of us use all over the world on climate change and climate change impacts. So, Carlo, tell us not only what you do, but also how useful is what you are doing for what we are talking about, I mean, solutions for climate change.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation of joining this panel. And thank to you, because it's not obvious to be in this room at this time of the day. We are all a bit sleep deprived and tired and walking around in this large venue, so I'm really honored to have so many people in the room. Thank you very much for being here. And as Carlo was saying, there is a natural connection between what Barbara presented and what I'm going to present, and this connection is data. I'm a climate scientist as a background, a physicist to be precise, so not necessarily the speaker you would expect talking about finance. Let's see if the presentation can start. Yeah, possibly. Good. But at the same time, climate has become so important that there is a natural nexus and a point of connection between the physical world and the finance space. And just as an example of that nexus, this morning I was in the office of the European Investment Bank, with whom we signed a memorandum of understanding a couple of years ago. Because, I mean, Barbara was referring to the taxonomy, but also the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. These are game changers. So for once, there are mechanisms that force financial institutions to look at the physical risk and disclose the risk in the financial decision. So this is opening up a lot of new opportunity, and they're building a gap, and they're bridging a gap that existed with respect to climate data. And we are not also only working with the European Investment Bank, we are working with other development banks, we are working with the World Bank, and so on and so forth. And just last week I was in Florence, where there was a symposium organized by the European Investment Bank on adaptation, because the other point I really picked up from the intervention of Barbara is this fact that while there is a large investment on mitigation, and that somehow, I mean, it's not a solved problem because of the funding gap, but is a problem we understand. Actually, on what does it mean to fund adaptation, I think we are still, there's still a lot of work to be done. And at the same time, we are seeing changes in the climate world, and I would say something about, that are so significant and so large that adaptation becomes an absolute urgent need that we need to look into. And in that need, there is, I think we need to reshape. I really like what you were saying about changing the financial, the way the financial sector approaches the problem, because the interaction has also often been based on an assumption of information deficit. And it's not necessarily the information deficit. It's really thinking about how to rebuild the nexus between the climate information and investment. So let me get into it. Well, first of all, I would like to say a few words about who we are. I work for the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast, which is arguably one of the organizations with the most complicated acronym. It's almost unpronounceable. It's CNWF, and it's even worse because the acronym changes depending on the language you pronounce it in. But it's a European institution, has been a leading institution on weather in the world. It's one of these little jewels we have in Europe that we don't speak often about, and the Americans look as often with interest, if not envy. And it's very much European. Now we have three sites, one in Reading in the UK, where the headquarters is. Most of the staff working with me is in Bonn, in Germany, and our supercomputer is well in the Mediterranean in Bologna. And since 2014, we are also the recipients of, we are effectively running on behalf of the European Commission 2 of the Copernicus services. So services, Copernicus is the European Union Earth Observation Program, so mostly dedicated to launch satellite and stuff like that. But there are 6 services, and 2 of these services, so the atmospheric monitoring and the climate change service, are run by ECNWF. And there is one thing I want you to notice in this, because I put some number. And the entire program costs less than 6 billion, and the service, the climate change service, is of the order of 240 million, give or take. And if you compare these numbers, and I will show to you the reach of the service and the impact it's having, with the numbers that Barbara was showing before about what is the gap and what is the issue in terms of climate adaptation. Well, this is peanuts. This program basically doesn't cost much. It's not even on the radar when you look at the global climate adaptation. So that's an important element to keep in mind. The other element to keep in mind is that everything we do within Copernicus is open and free, meaning that the data is provided to anyone for any sort of application, this being commercial or research or anything else. And that's part of the key element, because if we want to open up the market for climate services, the market or the use of climate information in the financial context, then we need to really open up the data. So what we do is climate data, and we provide data about the past, so observation, satellite information, ground-based observation. We do provide climate data about the present, and that's most of what we do, so up to 5 days ago from the 1940s. But we also produce data and provide data about the future. And this is important because while you may think, especially in the academia, you think about weather in one compartment, climate in another, and maybe there are other compartments. In reality, risk is on a continuum. Climate risk and weather risk and what's happening in the future is all connected. So having a single place where all this information is available is important. And we are trying to make this information meaningful for people. So one of the things we do every year, typically on Earth Day in April, is to publish a European State of the Climate report. So this looks at a number of indicators, both in terms of physical driver, but also more and more into impact. And this year next year, so the report for 2023, which will be published in April 2024, will be a joint report between ECNWF and the World Meteorological Organization. And this is important because it's a way of talking about climate that is naturally designed to be engaging. It's a report that is quite short, is written in plain English for anyone to read, is based on the web, is very interactive, and all the data behind and all the code behind is available for public scrutiny. So it's all in the open. And we look at a number of impact, and these impacts are not just the climate impact. For instance, one of the interesting one that it doesn't appear in this report, but that was very prominent in the previous report for 2021, was a drought, but not in the water, but a drought in the wind. And why is this is important? Well, it's important in the moment we are making a transition to an energy mix that is much more based on renewable energy. It's important to understand what is our baseline risk and how this baseline risk affects us. And this is quite interesting because this concept of wind drought first was hit the US market as a surprise. In 2012, there was a wind drought in the Midwest, and many companies went bust because simply didn't account for that eventuality. Europe was more prepared, but still, the event that we have seen in 2021 was largely unexpected in the northwest part of Europe, so Denmark, the North Sea, the Dutch coast, where most of actually capacity is installed at the moment. That area was significantly affected by the wind drought. We actually produce also a monthly bulletin looking at how the climate is evolving on a much shorter time scale, and probably what is on the menu on the first page of many newspapers these days is what has happened to the climate in 2023. And that's what I was meaning when I was talking about adaptation. 2023 is so unusual from any point of view that is hard to, it's hard for us, and Nuria is here in the audience and is responsible for our media engagement, and she knows how busy we are because every second day there is someone calling us up saying, what's happening? What is this? We got the warmest July on record, the warmest August on record, and every single month since July has been the warmest on record. And we are on track to be the warmest year on record. And a couple of weeks ago, we just passed in our data set the 2-degree threshold. So this is really incredible, unprecedented. But it's this routine production of the data that is making the difference, and is the natural interface to application and finance, for instance. And just to give you an idea of the scale of what we are doing, we have registered users. So by registered user, I mean someone of whom we have an email account and who has been active in using our data. And we have almost 300,000 of those. And to these people, we deliver an astonishing 150, 160 terabyte of data per day. It's just incredible, the scale of what we are doing at present. And many of these users are not academic users. I mean, there are clearly plenty of researchers and academics, that's a given. But there is a significant fraction of these users who are actually using the data to make decisions, to inform policy, to inform financial decisions. And this is a bit of a game changer for me, because it's the nexus we didn't have and is becoming more and more important. And I just want to make one concrete example. I can make many others, and happy to discuss with you if you're interested in the detail. But I want to make an example related to the energy sector. So in the case of the energy sector, this is actually the example I was mentioning to you before. This is the 2021 wind drought, and it's not just a lack of wind. If you transform this into something that makes sense to the people working on renewable energy, such as capacity factor, which is the fraction of the output that you expect a turbine to make, given the certain condition, then you can see that some regions have been really, really badly affected by the wind drought in 2021. And this is an information that is interesting for us as climate scientists, but it's an information that is interesting to a much wider set of stakeholders. So we signed a memorandum of understanding with ENTSO-E. ENTSO-E is the European Network for Transmission System Operator. So these are the organizations that run the transmission network in Europe. And they are guiding the investment in the new transmission networks. So if you want to design a grid that can cope with the climate of the future, then you want to be sure you have good quality data. And a couple of weeks ago, ENTSO-E has adopted in their annual meeting, has adopted the regulation that incorporate directly the information coming from the climate change service in their decision. And that's the nexus we need to work on. Another example is the one we have with IRENA. IRENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency, and tomorrow there will be a launch of a report by IRENA and WMO here at COP. And what you see on the right, again, is a good example of that nexus. What you see on the right is a study that IRENA conducted, trying to find the best location in Africa where to build new wind turbine and solar plants. And you see in green and in yellow the different regions that are optimal. But what is interesting in that optimal is that it's not just a climate decision. It's not just where there is enough wind or sun. It's a mix-up, it's a combination, it's a mash-up of the climate information that happen to come from Copernicus and the socioeconomic information on the ground. So where are the cities, where are the networks, how much will it cost to build a new grid connecting the source of the renewable power farm and the location where actually the energy will be used. So it's an example on how climate information, especially if produced operationally in a timely fashion, can make its way into financial decision. And in a sense, considering where we are at this stage and how much and how fast the climate around us is changing, is not only a desirable outcome, but it's very much a necessity. An example that involves more directly the private sector, still on the energy, that is probably the sector that is more active in picking up our data. This is a small, what is called an SME in European jargon, in the small or medium enterprise. In this case, it's a Spanish enterprise providing service to the renewable sector, and it's one of the companies that has been developing with the World Bank and a number of other institutions in Denmark, the Global Wind Atlas. So these are a global resource that is used to assess where how much wind you can, or how much energy you can harvest by building a wind farm in a certain location. And this again is built on climate data, and this company have done a nice exercise for us, trying to translate what does it mean for them and for the energy investment, an improvement in the characterization of the climate system. So considering how much, what is the cost of energy and what is the typical, the typical kind of project, then improving just by 1% the accuracy of the wind prediction translate globally to an astonishing amount of money. And again, this is the kind of thinking we should be doing more of. I don't want to take more of your time. The point that I'm keen to make is the fact that in order to bridge that transition from the way in which finance and climate have interacted in the past to where we should be, there needs to be action on the two sides. We need to rethink the way in which finance, especially for adaptation, is conceived, but on the other side, we need to rethink the way in which climate information is generated, curated, and distributed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. If I can make another example is with the banking sector, because the recent decision of the European Central Bank to include in the stress test performed for the European banks the climate risks implies that the European banks in all European states will need to assess climate risk for the customers of the banks in order to evaluate their own risk and in order then to determine the capital requirements imposed to protect the bank from these risks. And they need data. They don't have data to do this. They need granular data, very detailed data, to assess the risk of the companies working with the different banks in the different regions, areas of Europe. And this is another important task that Copernicus and ACMWF and other institutions working on data provision should perform in the coming years. It will be very, very important. And so thank you very much for what you said, and I hope it was clear how relevant is the work of ECMWF, how important it is. And now we can move to the last presentation. Last presentation is given by Maydis Carraro, who is the director of a fund, the Catalyst Fund that Barbara mentioned. And she's not here today because she's ill. She could not be in Dubai at COP, but she will be able to get connected. And I hope that the technology will help us and we'll be able to show her and her presentation at the same time. Please do it. Let's see whether it works.
Yeah,
she's here. Okay,
yeah.
Excellent. So half of it, let's see whether she will be able to present her slides as well. But let me spend a couple of words to explain why what she's going to say is important, because it's the last step of the kind of reasoning we've been going through in this side event, where Barbara told us that the difficult thing is to attract investments, financial flows towards adaptation. Most of it goes to mitigation, and in particular adaptation in developing countries, in general investment in developing countries. So the two difficult tasks are, on the one hand, moving from mitigation to adaptation, and the second one is moving from investments in Europe, Southeast Asia, and United States towards developing countries, and in particular North Africa and Africa. This work, this fund, the Catalyst Fund, which is supported by CPI, tries to accomplish both tasks. I think it's the most difficult thing because it tries to do both. On the one hand, increasing investment in adaptation, and in particular in African regions. So we would like to understand whether it works, how it works, if it works, how it works, and what are the first initiatives and first outcomes of this important effort to support investment adaptation in North Africa and Africa. So, Maydis, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Carlo. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. I have a little bit of a feedback, but hope that can be fixed by the technology. I'm really sorry not to be with everybody in person, but sometimes health first, but very excited to contribute to the conversation. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to jump right straight into it. As you did a fabulous job already introducing, the Catalyst Fund is an early stage impact fund and accelerator investing in tech startups, building a climate resilient future in Africa. So our goal is to partner with mission-driven founders that share a vision of a world where every individual has the tools and the opportunities they need to thrive in the face of climate impacts. We have been actually doing this for 7 years. So for the past 7 years, we've invested across the continent and across other emerging markets. So we really are an example of a private financier, private sector mover at the very early stage in the universe, I'd say, of climate funds that has been active for a while. But last year, we decided to launch, and thanks to CPI, this was made possible through the lab and the work we did with Barbara and her team, this new fund, which only invests in climate adaptation and resilience across the continent. And I'm going to tell you why we decided to make that decision against the many odds that are painted for the sector. There's lack of investable pipeline, it's lack of financing. So obviously that is not a good sign for other investors that want to enter the space, and many other barriers that we can discuss. As you all know in the room, Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change, in spite of contributing less than 4% to global CO2 emissions. And the numbers are already alarming. Nearly 50% of Africa's GDP is vulnerable to extreme climate patterns. Almost 350 million people are at risk of food insecurity because of climate change. 900 million more are going to experience climate-related water stress by 2050, and the list of such impacts goes on. So it's clear we're no longer at a point where we can say we can wait and see and actually mitigate in other areas of the world, because here the effects are already impacting communities that are the front line of these changes. And yet innovative solutions, as Barbara already said, in finance for adaptation are nowhere close where we should be. They're nowhere close where the needs are. In fact, the last climate finance landscape by CPI in 2022 focused on just Africa showed that the total climate finance need annually for Africa stands at 227 billion. And the current level is 30 billion. And of that, 11 is what goes to adaptation and resilience in Africa. And when you look at the proportion of public and private sector funding in Africa, only 3% of the funding comes from the private sector for adaptation, which does signal an absence of pipeline of investable projects. And when you zoom in, because we look at this closely, when you zoom into the venture capital or the private sector capital landscape or ecosystem in Africa alone, we see that there's really a dearth of private financiers of funds that are looking at these topics. And more specifically, first, there's very few funds dedicated to climate change in general. Like most are generalists, most look at other sectors, fintech in particular, or e-commerce, logistics, health are actually bigger sectors. Second, of the funds that do, most of them look at just energy. In fact, if we look at the 3 billion that has been invested into climate startups in Africa since 2019, the majority of that, 90%, has gone to the energy sector, energy and a little bit of water. Afolo is definitely much behind, using the name of the agriculture and forestry and land use sector that Barbara referred to. And so, there's basically no funds looking at climate adaptation and resilience independently. And then thirdly, the gap is extremely acute in that stage between pre-revenue and product market fit, which is basically the commercialization phase. So there is grant funding for incubation of ideas to develop to a certain degree until the point where the companies do need private capital. And that private capital that takes risk is also venture capital. So we really see a very important gap there that results into a valley of death for a lot of the young startups that are entering this space. And however, all of this picture might seem very gloom, but we think that there really isn't a better time to invest in climate adaptation and resilience in Africa than today. This is the best time possible. And why that is, first, Africa's natural resources and untapped renewable energy potential and rich biodiversity, and also a growing workforce of really talented and skill sets, young talent is there and makes the continent a hub for climate innovation. And the sector also, even albeit modestly, has actually been growing and resisting better than others to the market downturn that we've seen for the past year and the year prior. So this is a very positive endowments and signals that actually there's a lot that can be done to mobilize low carbon and very innovative solutions for adaptation and resilience for the continent by 2030. And the estimate here is that the overall sector actually is worth $2.8 trillion as an investment opportunity. So quite big. And this is why, as Catalyst Fund, we decided to enter the space, fill the gap that I was just talking about, and back high growth and high impact early stage climate ventures in Africa, help come early and help them scale to the point where then growth investors, private equity investors can take on and take them to the next stage of development. So how is our approach different? I would say three things I want to take you through. First, we are very thesis driven, and it's been very important for us to understand what is climate adaptation resilience solution. The universe is actually quite broad. So how do you define it? What do you live in? What do you leave out? We only invest in companies that meet our thesis and that where we really understand there's this potential for reducing climate vulnerability in the future. Second, we get in early. Like we invest at pre-seed. There is this valley of death. Like we want to be the first institutional investors after sort of the grant of philanthropic money maybe has gone there, or maybe some friends and family and angels. And we are the first injection of capital, and we want to help the companies grow by investing from pre-seed to Series A. So really the critical early stage gap. And then thirdly, we pair this capital with deep and bespoke venture building support. This is what I call human capital. In essence, and I'll tell you more later, but it's a team of experts that it's part of the fund. It's not external experts that really understand how to build a company from 0 to 1 and take it to scale and can cover all the essential needs that a founder has at the beginning of their journey. And this approach actually came from my own experience as an entrepreneur building in emerging markets, where it was very clear that capital was only one side of the equation, and what you needed is a lot more. It's support, it's technology access, network access, mentorship, etc. So let's start with our thesis to dive in. We invest in tech solutions to manage climate risks, adapt livelihoods, and build long-term resilience. And we fundamentally believe that every sector of the economy will have to adapt to climate change. So we took a multi-sector approach, and we decided to look at three verticals. First, fintech for climate resilience, which includes things like insurance, so insurtech for disasters, for assets, for crops, and the list goes on. Carbon finance solutions, emergency payments, and also climate risks and data solutions. The second vertical is sustainable livelihoods. So climate smart agriculture solution. This is a vast world, from precision agriculture to ag tech marketplaces, and solutions that allow farmers to improve their incomes in a way that is climate smart. Then the second category here is fishery management and aquaculture, huge potential on the continent, especially from a food security perspective, and then land use and restoration. And the third pillar we look at is climate smart essential services. And within this is services that will be essential in the warmer world: water management, water access, cold storage, waste management, healthcare, and some sustainable energy access as well, though that's going to be a much lower portion of the portfolio, as there's other funds focused on clean energy in particular on the continent. And I have to say that we've been lucky to find quite high quality pipeline and a number of startups that we've been very impressed with. So since early in 2023, we now invested in 16 startups. Our goal is to invest in 40 by the end of next year. And those companies now cover 7 markets, from South Africa to Kenya, Uganda, Egypt, Senegal, Nigeria, Morocco even, and 8 adaptation sectors. And most of the companies are building exactly in those sectors, such as agriculture, food systems and food security, land restoration, insurance, waste management, water access. So we are seeing this diversity of innovation, something that was not there even just 3-4 years ago. And I think it's also a result of the awareness among entrepreneurs who are now recognizing that what they're building is a climate smart solution or can also become one if you apply a certain lens or you use a certain data set. And data is absolutely essential here in the case, for example, of financial services or supply chain optimization, etc. So giving you a few concrete examples, one company I absolutely adore is Santa Green. It's a company in Morocco, and they are transforming deserts into cultivable land through agroforestry and solar-powered desalination units. So they have the solar-powered desalination units, which are very modular, and a drip irrigation system that takes the water that comes from the desalination and then use ancestral agroforestry techniques, training local farmers to then restore the land and really bring these deserts back to life. And I wish I could show you a photo. It is quite drastic, like where they were present before it was complete drought, and then just a year later, obviously it does take some time. You start seeing trees growing again and local crops that it was not possible to cultivate before. And here the yield in 5 years, they're hoping to already return 5x on the investment, and the yield improvement and the income increase for the farmers is going to be really drastically more than what the livelihoods would otherwise have been. Another example is a company called AgroSupply in Uganda. They're using a USSD-based, so actually not even that technological at all, system to allow farmers to save via QR code system on their phone and use those savings later on to access drought-resistant seeds and other inputs so that farmers have them in the case of bad weather seasons, etc., and obviously in the case of droughts, which are growing in Uganda. In addition to that, they provide access to area yield and index insurance. So very essential combination of financial services, inputs, and other practices or advice for the farmers for how to cope with climate change. And this company is already doing $5 million in annual recurring revenue. They already worked with 26,000 farmers in Uganda. So it's a fantastic example of what this can look like, both high tech and then lower tech. And then third point I wanted to make, as I said earlier, capital alone is not enough. And this is why we built our model to always combine our capital with human capital. So our team becomes the interim CTO, the interim CMO, the head of marketing, the head of growth, head of talent that can work alongside the founding teams of the startups and really plug the gaps that they have at that early stage. And they can't afford to hire these expertise, because at that point you don't have enough capital. You're just barely a team of, say, 5 or 10. And what you need is actually somebody that de-risks your journey. We talk a lot about de-risking capital for investors, but I think it's equally important to talk about de-risking the entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial journey. And so we work alongside them with our team of in-house experts across all the range of functions that you really need at the start: fundraising, user understanding, product, tech and data, design. And for 7 months, we're kind of part of one team. And then after that, can continue to support them alongside their journey via governance and leadership and our relationship as investors on their board. An example of this, because it's often hard to understand when you just talk in sort of abstract terms, is exactly what we did with Santa Green, the company I was telling you about. They were at a critical juncture because they had done a few years of R&D with grant funding, and yet they needed to find a way to make the solution more scalable, more modular, and apply technology in the right way so that this could become a Pan-Africa solution. Right now, it's just in Morocco. None of the founding team had the right technological skill sets. So our team came in, and we helped them first figure out how to think about a softer farm management solution that could combine sort of the hard technology that they have. And they can do that with existing tools. They don't have to reinvent the wheel, recode anything. So we help them choose how to develop it with existing tools. And then our own product manager in-house designed the software itself, the user interface, tested it with farmers, helped them make sure that it was scalable across a number of plantations, because the point is to make this almost like a franchise model across a number of plantations. And then we helped them recruit a CTO that now is fully on board. The modeling software is developed and launched, and the goal for Center Green is to reach 10,000 hectares by 2030. Currently, there are 30 hectares of land. Obviously, it's the beginning, but that's the kind of transformation that we're hoping to inspire at the early stage, and then to set the companies on a path to growth. And I'll leave you with our hope for the future. The fund itself wants to make 20 million lives more resilient to climate change. We want to, of those, reach more women, because we do believe that women are incredibly important to the solution to the climate crisis. And so we made it a point that we want to back 40% women founders that can create solutions that then go on to benefit women as users as well. We want to enable the creation of jobs, conserve water, make sure that the fund investees restores hectares of land, and obviously above everything, as an early stage pre-seed catalyzer, we want to mobilize more funding for this space, because it's so critical that more flows to adaptation and resilience. So our goal is that of our capital, at least $1 billion more gets mobilized for African adaptation and resilience innovation. So I'll leave it here. I know we want to have 15 minutes for questions at least, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I hope you could hear me clearly on the video. Thank you.
Really, thank you for resisting so long. You might have noticed that there was a change in program, but the original speaker, Professor Youssef Brouzin, was retained to something important, but MEDEC, that we are very proud to work with, never fails and has sent a substitute at the last minute. Let me introduce Dr. Jan Wilkins. But before that, please stay with me for a little story. Science policy interface, science economy interface, science people interface. Without an effective adventure of this kind, we wouldn't be here. People have heard more or less that the Mediterranean is a climate hotspot, and it's stayed a little bit in the air in policy, in economy, as a legend. This was a problem that reflected very concretely, for instance, in this place where we are today. We have a case with the Mediterranean, the second fastest warming region in the world. The waters of the Mediterranean are the fastest warming in the world, associated to these two measurements. There are, I would dare to say, terrible impact forecasts, but still it was a narrative that couldn't pass, and it couldn't pass here at the COP for a strange reason. If you take the Mediterranean, in the United Nations system, it is fragmented into 3 negotiating groups, 2 of which are in the logics of the COP on opposite sides. So, Houston, we have a problem, but we cannot talk about it at the United Nations. And still, at a certain point, this problem became described in a precise way. Thanks to, how would I say, the engagement of a group of scientists who started working voluntarily. We backed them together with UNEP-MAP, the Mediterranean Action Program of UNEP, went through a huge meta-analysis that produced the first report on the situation of climate in the Mediterranean in 2019. They worked with a strange methodology, a little bit inspired by us, let me boast too. But it's a group of scientists that work voluntarily into a meta-analysis, and when they write the conclusion, they involve the official representatives of states to make sure that, not for states to say you shouldn't say the truth, but to make sure that the language is the one that can pass. So this report came out 2019. Something happened. First, we started to be recognized here. But second, something more important happened. States across the Mediterranean started to recognize that they are part of a shared problem. And so developments, even negotiation developments, started to come very fast. I don't have time and I don't want to bother you with how much was achieved based on that, but I can tell you in synthesis that in the Mediterranean region...
We have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I shouldn't take too much. In the Mediterranean region, the state of the agreements that have been stricken is far more advanced than the state of what's being discussed here at the COP. It all became possible when this notion, the Mediterranean is a climate hotspot, was transformed by scientists into a precise concept in an understandable wording. Sorry I'm leaving you only 10 minutes, but I'm sure you'll be a terrific persuader.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to replace my colleague, and also thank you for that intervention, because I think that's really already says quite a lot of what we are currently doing. Of course, working on the next reports at MEDEC, but also points out to an issue that I would maybe kind of highlight here, and I think fits very nice to what has been said before, and that is that as the Mediterranean region is so highly affected, of course, it is of course a good example of the challenges regarding finance, of course, and bringing together science, policy, and also entrepreneurs. But I think it's also a good example of going deeper into that discussion of what are we actually talking about when we talk about adaptation, right? So in the especially Eastern Mediterranean region, as an example, that's a region where I work, we see that a lot of adaptation measures are not coordinating, and they could be described as coping with the situation at best. So, and I think that's really one point where I think if we really want to go beyond this, so speaking also about something like transformational adaptation, then I think it's really crucial also to think about how finance can come in. And I think the previous speakers have already highlighted some really nice examples also in the previous presentation. Which then, of course, kind of connects to a second point and a second really challenge, that is we are talking about a situation that is not just in recent months, but for some time also facing other challenges. So the connection to other conflicts, migration are a really big topic, and the link between climate change and conflict is not always entirely clear. But what is clear is that in this situation it is highly challenging to attract capital or finance or investment. And I think this is also something that needs to be addressed. And just as a third and last point, given the time, I'd like also to link up with your presentation before, and that's the role of knowledge and knowledge production, right? So we have a lot of knowledge in climate research, and Copernicus has been really central. But I think also this really shows that we need a science policy connection, but also better integrate climate science, quantitative science, and qualitative research. Because if we go into these conflict zones, then it's also really depending on understanding dynamics on the ground. And I think there's a lot we can do by sharing and integrating these kind of existing data to also address this. So I think I will leave it at this for now, and so that others have a chance to ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for quick questions, or maybe questions from those on watching the live streaming of the side event. Is there maybe questions coming from there? No questions from the floor? Please. 3. You have 2 there.
I hear you speak a lot about like the barriers to entrepreneurs being able to implement innovative business models, especially in developing regions. I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into depth on what a couple of those barriers are specifically.
Okay, can we get the other question as well?
Hi. So I come from Italy, and recently Italy has done surprising announcement on climate finance, loss and damage, and over the year Italy has made a priority to invest in Africa and the Mediterranean region, and has launched the idea of a plan of investment for Africa, and there is a climate fund. So I would ask probably Dr. Buchanan, what would you recommend to a country like Italy that is starting to look at a continent like Africa? What are the financial instruments that can be used, and how to invest properly in climate finance in this continent? Thank you.
If I may add
Sorry.
The person who asked the question didn't want to, but she represents the Italian think tank on climate, ECHO, which is a growingly important reality. Sorry.
Thank you. Just the dilemma of investing in renewables in a way that may take up the very land that's needed for food. So, for example, do you do offshore wind, or can you do solar panels? Do you take that into account
Okay, thank you. Barbara, quickly.
Quickly is good. This is like big.
3 minutes left. Okay.
Okay, that's a big question. I think we might have to talk afterwards. I think they're somehow connected. I think your question, though, what's the barriers? And I think Maël has actually highlighted some of them. I think it is capacity, very often, just not having the skill sets, not knowing how to deal with some of the instruments or how to access finance. I think capacity, access to finance, having actually the money go towards some of the regions where these entrepreneurs are. But I think one of the important point is really also the policies, the regulatory environment. So I think what we see, policies still lead the way. If you have a good enabling environment where there's certainty on that there will be benefits, and this is an opportunity, that usually helps just at least kind of make this first step. But again, much more to be discussed. In terms of the instruments, I think first of all, I think it's fantastic to see the interest from Italy to do more. I think there's a growing number of instruments. Obviously, you can go through some of the multilateral development banks and kind of some of the climate funds that are operating on the continent. At the same time, I think you should invest in Maël's, in the Catalyst Fund. There is a lot of really innovative structures that have already a track record. So I think it's like thinking about what needs, what are the priority sectors for Italy, and then based on these sectors, like understanding there's a lot that's already happening. So the important thing is to not reinvent the wheel, but really understand how can you use existing instruments and funds, and then go into and really helping to kind of shift the ecosystem there. But yeah, to be continued after the session.
We have 1 minute left.
I can try a very, very quick reaction to the last point, the last question, because I think you are touching one of the most challenging elements, and is the element of co-benefit, adaptation, mitigation, for instance. And it's not, I think it's a nut that has not been cracked. We just start now. I mean, for instance, the example of deforestation as a way to mitigate climate change without considering the impact this may have on forest fire or availability of water resources. So that's another really interesting interface that we need to explore more.
Time is over. As we heard, we have no more time, so thank you very much for attending this side event in person. Thank you to those attending from home or wherever you are. Thank you very much. Thank you, Romenos. Cooperation with the Union for Mediterranean has been very, very positive. If you want to say final word.
Thank you.